Very good evening and warm welcome to all delegates far across from Dapoli, Khed, Mahad, Goregaon, Mandgaon, Tara, and Masala, Sibal. I also welcome Dr. Samir Milinkeri, sir, behalf of the Janakalyan Blood Bank and the doctors who are watching the webinar. Friends, Janakalyan Blood Center already crossed 25 years of emergency medical services in the peripheral area. It happens because of your continuous support and cooperation. This year, we already crossed collection and distribution of more than 2,500 bottles per annum, which is in all-time great figure out of all active peripheral blood centers across the state. It's the emergency line of service 24/7. Janakalyan Blood Bank already run 2 full-fledged storage centers in Mandgaon as well as in Khed. So now this year we are planning for another 2 storage centers. Friends, I am very glad and very pleased to announce that now we enter the new era of component separation unit. It's highly ambitious project of Janakalyan Blood Center. To run and to make it viable, your contribution and your cooperation is needed as well. Instead of whole blood, now we can distribute the components of blood bottles, that is Paxil volume, FPP, fresh frozen plasma, platelets, and cryoprecipitated anti-hemolytic factors. So I'm requesting Senior BTO, Dr. Pawar. Sir, please officially inaugurate the webinar.
Myself, Dr. Pawar, Senior BTO, Janakalyan Blood Bank. I request to start webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So we have with us the senior surgeon, Dr. Sunil Nangaonkar, and who is also the honorable director of this Janakalyan Blood Center. So I'm requesting Dr. Sunil. Sir, please introduce today's faculty, Dr. Samir Milinkeri. Sir.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Rahul has already introduced the today's topic and agenda of today's meeting. For today's meeting, we have an eminent speaker, Dr. Samir Milinkeri. Is it audible here? Dr. Milinkeri, who is the eminent hematologist and bone marrow transplant. There's some problem with audio. Hello. Is it okay now? Yes. To introduce Dr. Milinkeri, he has passed graduation from Immune. Is it audible? I can't hear. Dr. Samir Milinkeri, he has done his graduation from prestigious institute, BJ Medical College, Pune, and then subsequently he has done hematology from hematology from CMC Vellore. Currently, he is head of department hematology and bone marrow department at Banana Mangesh Hospital, Pune. So friends, I introduce Dr. Milinkeri. Now I welcome Dr. Milinkeri and request him to start the session. At the end of session, we have a question answer session. Those who have any questions, kindly write down on the paper and you can answer after his session. Dr. Nilankari will start. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, sir. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So I hope I'm audible properly. Is there any issue in the voice?
Nothing, sir.
No.
Okay, fine. So today's topic is going to be rational use of blood components. And unfortunately, we cannot meet face to face. Otherwise, I would have loved to interact with you and understand, a lot of things about the transfusion policies you have in Mahad and the surrounding areas. But nevertheless, whole blood has a shelf life of say about 35 to 42 days and a volume of about 500 ml. Can you tell me any indication for blood transfusion? Can you think of any indication where whole blood would be used and instead of components? So if you ask me, or if you ask anybody in any sort of say hematologist, we would clearly tell you that there is no place for whole blood today in modern medical practice. Okay, there is only one indication to transfuse whole blood today, and that is when blood components are not available. Okay, so prior to so if you are in a peripheral area where there are no components available, you have to transfuse blood, and that's the only place today where you would give whole blood. Otherwise, there is no place for whole blood. And why is this the case? So the problem with whole blood is that it contains RBCs of about 250 ml. But remember that whole blood does not contain platelets, right? When you collect whole blood and you freeze it and you store it, the platelets die immediately. It does not contain coagulation factor. So there is a misnomer that people think that whole blood is it contains everything. It will contain platelets, it will contain clotting factors, it will contain fresh plasma, but that is not the case. So in fact, it doesn't contain any platelets, doesn't contain any clotting factors, and it only contains about 250 ml of plasma, which contains albumin. Okay, and this this 250 ml of sort of, let's say, dead plasma is only going to add volume without adding any components. Okay, it is only going to add volume. So let's take an example of a lady who was pregnant, who was a primigravida. She has abruptio placentae, and she delivers, and as there is severe postpartum hemorrhage, and she has lost a lot of blood. Her hemoglobin has dropped down from 12 grams to 7 grams suddenly. So she is sort of almost collapsed, and her platelet count has also dropped down to 50,000. If you check her prothrombin time and her APTT, they're markedly prolonged, which indicates that this patient is in disseminated intravascular coagulation. She's in DIC, which is a very common problem with the certain obstetric indications, certain obstetric complications. The fibrinogen, which is another test which we do to diagnose DIC, is extremely low. So the question is going to be, what is your management strategy, right? So you have a patient who has got severe anemia. So obviously she needs RBCs. She has thrombocytopenia. She's going to require platelet transfusions. And she has a severe coagulopathy because all the coagulation factors have been consumed in the coagulation process. In trying to arrest the bleeding, all the clotting factors have been utilized, and therefore there is deficiency. So we need to transfuse her components. Now imagine if this lady came to you in Mahad before you had any blood components available. What would you do? You would transfuse her whole blood, right? The whole blood will definitely correct the hemoglobin, right? It will definitely correct the hemoglobin. But she has 50,000 platelets. You are now going to add on a volume which does not contain platelets. So what you're going to do is you're going to dilute out the patient's own existing platelets. Similarly, the patient already has depletion of coagulation factor. That is why the PT and the APTT are prolonged, right? Now, because the coagulation factors are depleted, if you add on more plasma, which does not contain coagulation factors, you're going to dilute out whatever coagulation factors the patient already has. And this is going to lead to a situation of dilutional coagulopathy. You understand this point? So in fact, you're correcting the anemia, but you're doing more harm by depleting the platelets and the clotting factors, by adding more volume to the blood, which, so here is a classic example where you need, absolutely, you have to have components. You will need to give this patient platelets. You will need to give this patient fresh frozen plasma, right? So that's the importance of not using whole blood anymore. If you ask in our blood bank, in Mangeshkar Hospital blood bank, or in many of the major hospital blood banks in the cities, you will not find whole blood. Okay, there is just no whole blood. You have to specifically, there is no reason to, I haven't asked for whole blood in several years now. But if you want whole blood also, the blood bank will not provide you, because they don't keep. Everything is, all blood that is collected is divided into components, right? So you have only packed RBCs. Okay, so what are the blood components? Let's just see these, see what components are prepared in the blood bank. So these are packed red blood cells. You can call them PRBCs, or commonly in Maharashtra we call them PCV. Okay, packed cell volume. Then you have the platelets, you have the fresh frozen plasma, and you have another component called as the cryoprecipitate, which also I will discuss a little later. So how is this prepared? Okay, so if you take blood in a test tube, and if you sort of centrifuge this test tube, you will see that the cells which are the heaviest, that is the red blood cells, get centrifuged and they sink at the bottom. Then above this, there is a layer of the white blood cells, which is formed here. And this is the buffy coat. This is called as the buffy coat. This contains the platelets and the leukocytes. And over and above that, you'll have the plasma, right? So when blood is collected in a bag like this, that bag is also centrifuged in the blood bank. And you have a similar layer of RBCs, the WBCs, the platelets, and then the plasma sitting like this, right? And now you just need to separate these components. So when you collect whole blood like this, generally there will be a triple bag. There'll be a triple bag attached to it. So there are two more bags like this. You centrifuge this blood, you'll have a separation of the RBCs down. And when you do a light centrifuge, you don't do a very heavy spin, you do a light spin. And when you do a light spin, you'll have the FFPs and the platelets all accumulating like this. So the platelets also move upwards. And then these platelets are collected in one bag. This platelets and FFPs is collected in one bag like this. Then this bag is separated, and this bag is spun heavily. So it's like a very fast spin. When you do a fast spin, what happens is the platelets all settle down to the bottom and the plasma separates on top. And then you remove this plasma and transfer it into the other bag. And so you have 1 unit of FFP, 1 unit of platelets, and 1 unit of RBCs. Now, how do you separate? How do you push the contents of this, say here? So how do you separate the contents and push it into this? That is done with a simple plasma extractor. There's an extractor like this, which sort of compresses the blood bag like this, and therefore, when you compress it, the plasma on top will move from this tube and go into the other tube. So from a healthy donor, you collect the blood in a triple bag system and add some additive solutions, which are typically called as Adsol or Sagum. And these are sort of nutrient solutions, which sort of keeps the red blood cells, it provides nutrient to the red blood cells when they are being stored. Okay, so it increases the shelf life of these RBCs. And then I just described this technique: low spin, separate the platelet-rich plasma in the second bag, add a solution to the red blood cells, and separate the PRBCs with a high spin, separate the FFPs into the third bag, and then you make 3 bags. Right? Now there is another technique of another blood component, another technique of separating blood components, that is called as the apheresis technique. And I'm not sure if this technique is available in Mahad at the moment, but I do hope and pray that this technique also finds its way in Mahad in case it is not already available. Okay, and what is this technique? In this technique, you don't have to donate 1 unit of blood. So supposing if you donate 1 unit of blood, you are allowed to donate blood again directly after 3 months, right? And you can produce from that blood, you can produce only 1 unit of red cells, 1 unit of platelets, and 1 unit of plasma. Now, if you want only one of these blood components to be separated in a large volume, then you use this apheresis technique. In this, it's a very simple technique in which the donor sitting on a couch like this, his blood is flowing into this cell separator machine, and there is a centrifuge inside this machine which sort of separates out whichever component of the blood you want. So if you want to separate plasma, you can do plasma, a large volume plasma can be separated. You can separate platelets in large volume. So when you have one single donor apheresis bag, that is equal to something like 8 to 10 units of random donor platelet bag. So you can, and this donor can again donate like 1 or 2 weeks later. So you can extract a large volume of blood component from one individual by apheresis technique. And in our practice, in the hematology practice, not only SDPs, but we also do plasma pheresis on this machine. We do granulocyte pheresis. So if I have a patient, say, who has received intensive chemotherapy and is severely neutropenic and has developed an infection, and I need to give him, I want to transfuse white blood cells, I want to transfuse granulocytes, then I can separate out only granulocytes from a particular donor and infuse them into that patient, neutropenic patient, to fight the infections. I can do an RBC red cell exchange, RBC exchange can be done. So large volume of RBCs alone can be removed, and new RBCs can be infused at the same time into this patient. We also extract, typically when we do a bone marrow transplant, we remove the hemopoietic stem cells from the blood also by the same technique. So you name the cell of the blood and you can separate. Okay, now after you've separated the blood components, how do you store them, right? Now this storage is done by strictly controlled conditions in the blood bank, and the shelf life is the maximum allowable storage time under acceptable temperature and conditions of storage. Now the whole blood or packed RBCs have to be stored at 4 degrees, and they can last for 35 to 42 days depending upon which additive solution you added. Platelets, importantly, you must know that they cannot be frozen. They cannot be kept at 0 to 4 degrees. They will die immediately. You have to keep them at 20 to 22 degrees. And not just keep them, you have to shake them. They're typically kept on a machine which constantly is shaking. If you keep platelets still for a long time, then they tend to die. So they have to be shaken. And this is so important, I often wonder, supposing you don't have a blood component unit in a peripheral area, and you need platelets to transfuse a particular patient. You often have to travel sometimes to Pune, or sometimes to far off places, 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers down the line. And there you collect your platelets and you transport them. The transport temperature is different. The platelets are not constantly being agitated. And therefore, I really wonder, when you get platelets from outstation, how many of those platelets are actually, alive by the time you actually transfuse them to the recipient, right? So this is a big problem, and that is why it is important that components facility should be available in every part of India. Okay. And FFPs, fresh frozen plasma or cryoprecipitates, have to be kept at -80 degrees, and they can be stored for a period of 1 year. Okay. Okay, now let's discuss a little bit about packed RBCs. Okay, now this is the product of choice in anemia. Its volume is about 350 ml. And remember that the rate of infusion and how much time do you transfuse 1 unit of PCV to a patient, you complete it within 1.5 to 2 hours. The whole blood is something which you keep for about 4 hours. You don't exceed 4 hours, because otherwise the cells start to lyse. So you must finish whatever transfusion are within 4 hours. But PRBCs, please remember, try to transfuse it within 2 hours time. You often don't have to give any pre-medication unless the patient actually develops a reaction. And in general, 1 unit of PRBC raises the hemoglobin by 1 gram. What is the indication of red cell transfusion? To increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Acute blood loss in excess of 15% of the blood volume, based on vital signs, you decide to transfuse. And symptomatic anemia. Okay. What is the advantage over whole blood? It's smaller in volume, lesser risk of fluid overload, It's especially important in cardiac renal failure patients and severe anemia, neonates. It has better oxygen carrying capacity, dilutional coagulopathy is avoided, and adverse effects of plasma transfusion can be avoided. What are the indication of RBC transfusion? So if a patient has very severe anemia, okay, somebody comes to you with a hemoglobin of 3 grams, but the diagnosis is, a nutritional anemia, megaloblastic anemia. The patient is asymptomatic. You don't unnecessarily have to transfuse them. When you can correct the cause of anemia rapidly with drugs, with medications, you do not have to transfuse such a patient. So only if the patient is symptomatic, you transfuse. Somebody who's got nutritional iron deficiency anemia, hemoglobin of 3 grams, but just a little bit of symptoms, mild fatigue, he's able to walk easily without discomfort. Just looking at the hemoglobin, don't decide to transfuse him. Transfuse only if the patient is symptomatic. So this is called as rational use of blood product. Just because you see anemia doesn't mean you have to transfuse. But somebody who's an elderly man diagnosed to have a CS stomach and hemoglobin is 6 grams, patient is bleeding, recent drop in hemoglobin. Yes, this patient, even if the hemoglobin is 6 or 7 grams, if the patient is symptomatic, you must transfuse. A transfusion is not indicated if patient has chronic compensated anemia. I just discussed this. And yeah, so if your patient has a heart, lung, or heart disease, or lung disease, or illnesses that pose any threat, then you tend to have a lower threshold for transfusion. Avoid doing these top-up transfusions unless they are genuinely indicated, particularly important for anesthetists. Often anesthetists want slightly higher hemoglobin, and therefore they might just give top-up transfusions, but that's not indicated if the patient is has a hemoglobin of which is appropriate, say more than 7 grams. In chemotherapy-related anemias, we keep a threshold of 7 grams. So 7 grams is a general threshold. So where below 7 grams you call it severe anemia, above 7 grams you call it non-severe anemia. In thalassemia major patients, we keep a hemoglobin cutoff of 9 grams. Okay, one quick question I'm going to ask you. Say you have an Rh negative patient. Okay, you have an Rh negative patient who has a 60-year-old man who has polytrauma and his blood group is O negative, and he needs 10 units of blood quickly because he's bleeding and you need to operate him. And the whole of Mahad has only 4 units of O negative blood. Okay, and you want to give him more, or you don't have O negative blood, say for example. So what are you going to do in this emergency? It's an emergency situation. What will you do, right? Now, what is the problem of negative versus positive? You can easily transfuse negative blood to a positive patient. Okay, so somebody who has got a negative group, you can very well transfuse his blood to a Rh positive person. But if you transfuse Rh positive blood to an Rh negative person, what is going to happen is that his body is going to see that Rh antigen, which his body doesn't contain, and therefore he will produce antibodies against Rh, right? And because of these antibodies, in future, if you transfuse positive blood, he's going to destroy those RBCs, right? But remember that to produce those antibodies, he is going to require about 2 weeks. When you are exposed to an antigen, to produce antibodies, it generally takes at least 2 weeks, right? You get a vaccine, to respond to that vaccine, you're going to take 2 weeks at least. So in this patient also, so you can always transfuse O positive blood to a negative person in case of an emergency, right? Because it's going to take a long time to produce those antibodies, and only subsequent transfusions it would be a problem. But in this case, you can always, in emergency, transfuse when you're transfusing for the first time. Okay. Next, coming to fresh frozen plasma. Okay. What is fresh frozen plasma? So it basically contains all the coagulation factors, plasma which contains coagulation factors. It also has albumin, and it is correct when you collect the plasma, you freeze it to below minus 20 degrees within 6 hours of collection. Okay, and then if you collect it if you freeze it within 6 hours, the coagulation factors remain live. Okay, otherwise they start degrading. After 6 hours, they all start degrading, and then you will not have any coagulation factors. And this is then frozen at minus 80 degrees freezers. The typical volume is between 200 to 250 ml. If you're going to use large volume of FFP, you must make sure it is group specific. But a cross matching is not necessary. When you are sort of infusing the FFPs, they have to be first thawed to room temperature, and only after they're thawed, you can transfuse them within 15 minutes. So as you never take a long time to transfuse the FFPs, try and finish them within 15 minutes. But if there's a constraint, you can always transfer it something like 30 minutes or so. One bag in about 15 to 30 minutes. You must handle those frozen bags with care, otherwise sometimes they tend to break open. What is the indication to transfuse FFPs? So anybody who has a multiple coagulation factor deficiency, such as in DIC, the case that we discussed, if you're going to give massive transfusion and you're going to dilute out the patient's own coagulation factors to prevent dilutional coagulopathy, you give along with the RBCs. So if you've given whole blood volume, say about 10 RBCs you've given, then along with that, you must give FFPs as well to prevent this phenomenon called dilutional coagulopathy. Somebody who's got a liver disease, a decompensated liver disease, liver produces all the coagulation factors. So in liver dysfunction, you're going to have a prolonged prothrombin time, and these patients, if they're bleeding, you would need to transfuse. FFPs. Now, if you have a patient with, say, hemophilia and you don't have coagulation factors available, then you're going to need to transfuse FFPs in that situation, because they contain all the 13 coagulation factors. So any one coagulation factor deficiency, you don't have that coagulation factor available, you can give FFPs. Okay, and then in exchange transfusion as well, in certain situations, you can use FFPs. What is the dosage of FFP? The usual dosage of FFP is 15 ml per kg of the recipient's weight. So supposing you have a patient who is about 60 kilos, and you want to know how many FFPs to transfuse this patient. He's come to you with DIC. You want to transfuse FFPs. If he's 60 kilos, 15 ml per kg would be about 900 ml. And each FFP, if you consider it as 250 ml, you will give about 4 FFPs for a 60 kilo person. So in one go, you can give 4 FFPs. And this may need to be repeated as the situation demands. So if you have DIC, you've given you're trying to correct the DIC, correct the primary cause. You've given FFPs now, but 6 hours later, the patient is still having a prolonged coagulation times. You can transfuse it again, okay, as the situation demands. Now, what is the inappropriate use of FFPs? It is thought that FFPs is something which contains a lot of nutrition. The nutrients of the blood are in FFPs, and therefore some people have this thinking that you can use it for treatment of immunodeficiency, for volume expansion, because it contains albumin. You can give volume expansion as a source of nutrients. So these are all wrong indications. Okay, wrong indications to transfuse FFPs. There are appropriate components for each of these. For immunodeficiencies, you can give immunoglobulins. For volume expansion, you can give IV albumin or crystalloids. As a source of nutrients, you can always give parenteral nutrition. So you cannot use FFP as a substitute for any of these conditions. The last component is, the third component, not the last, is called cryoprecipitates. Okay, now this is something which you may not be using very frequently, but in tertiary centers where we see a lot of these coagulopathies, DICs, cryoprecipitates are very important. Okay, what is cryoprecipitate? So when you take a unit of fresh frozen plasma, you have to thaw it, and when you're thawing it, a large volume of the plasma gets separated out, but there is a small component of there are certain coagulation. I'm getting a disturbance somewhere. Okay, I'm getting a disturbance. Somebody please mute your phones, please. Your mobiles. I think Dr. Bharti Khopkar, you're not muted. Okay. So so cryoprecipitate contains, what does cryoprecipitate contain? It contains factor 8, it contains von Willebrand's factor, it contains factor 13, and it contains fibrinogen. Okay, and when do you use cryoprecipitate? Use it for treatment of in hemophilia A. You don't have, say, access to factor 8 concentrates. You can give cryoprecipitate. The advantage is that it's a very small volume. You have to give a whole of 250 ml of volume, whereas in cryoprecipitate the volume is only about 30 ml. So in these conditions, you can get away with by giving a small volume of the product. And the important reason is in DIC, where it acts as a source of fibrinogen. Because it contains a fibrinogen concentrate, you can give a large amount of fibrinogen in a small volume. So this is a situation where we commonly use cryoprecipitates. And the last component that we're going to talk about is platelets. Okay. So platelets, as you know, there are random donor platelets, there is single donor platelets. Random donor platelets are prepared from 1 unit of blood, and it yields about 5 into 10 to the power 10 platelets. Okay, whereas a single donor platelet will reduce, will yield about 3 into 10 to the power 11 platelets. So 1 log more. So about 10 RDPs might be equal to 1 SDP. What are the indications of platelet transfusion? So prophylactically, somebody who's received chemotherapy and has developed thrombocytopenia, or somebody who has thrombocytopenia and is sort of going to undergo surgery, there you would like to have a higher platelet count, and therefore you would transfuse platelets before the patient sort of bleeds. Therapeutic indication would be a patient with thrombocytopenia or dysfunctional platelets who has bleeding. There you would want to give platelets. So you need to understand what is a hemostatic platelet count. So a normal platelet count is between 1.5 to 4.5 lakhs. But a platelet count of more than 50,000 is sufficient for the body for all its hemostatic functions. So if you're going to do any surgery, you need to have a platelet count of more than 50,000. You're going to do a biopsy, your platelet count has to be more than 50,000. Except when you are doing a very delicate surgery, की जिथे थोडंसं जरी bleeding झालं तरी it can cause a disaster. अशा ठिकाणी आपण अशा surgeries मध्ये फक्त आपण platelet count ला 1 lakh च्या वर ठेवतो, and that is neurosurgeries, retinal surgeries किंवा delicate plastic surgeries. Here you want to have a platelet count of more than 1 lakh. Otherwise, 50,000 is sufficient. Okay. Yeah, and there are some situations where the platelet count is normal, but the platelets become dysfunctional. And this is if you are using NSAIDs. They act as antiplatelet drugs. In bypass surgeries, when you do a bypass surgery, the platelets become transiently dysfunctional. So even with a normal platelet count, you can still have bleeding. And in uremia, somebody who has severe uremia, also the platelets tend to become very dysfunctional. So here you may need to transfuse. When you're transfusing platelets, but you're seeing a very poor platelet increment, okay, what are these situations? You need to understand, and you must know how, when to transfuse platelets and when not to transfuse platelets. So if you have somebody who has sepsis झाल्यावरती platelets consumption भयानक वाढतं. त्यामुळे if you're transfusing platelets to somebody who is in severe infection, you may see that you're giving platelets, but you're not getting that much of a requirement, so of an increment. Therefore, you may have to transfuse more platelets. DIC, again, because of excessive consumption of platelets, you will not get a rapid increment. Active hemorrhage, obviously, that is the case. Splenomegaly जर एखाद्याला असेल तर what happens is you have a situation called hypersplenism. जे काय प्लेटलेट्स आपण देतो स्प्लीनच्या आतमध्ये जाऊन बसतात, त्यांना बाहेर यायला वेळ लागतो. आणि त्यामुळे स्प्लेनोमेगली खूप असेल तर यू सी की जे काही प्लेट्स आपण देतोय त्यातनं मध्ये देऊन सुद्धा एवढी वाढ दिसत नाही. Then somebody who has received multiple transfusions in the past. When you get multiple transfusions, you become alloimmunized, meaning you will, if you receive platelets which don't contain antigens which your body contains, then you will destroy those platelets. If you have seen those platelets in the past, you're going to destroy them. And therefore, alloimmunization is a problem for platelet transfusion. Somebody is a thalassemia major who has received transfusions every month for several years. Such patients are going to become alloimmunized to platelets, and therefore, when these patients are transfused platelets for whatever reason, they don't get a good increment. And the last condition is ITP, immune thrombocytopenia. If you have an immune thrombocytopenia, you have antibodies against your own platelets. When you transfuse platelets, you are not going to see any rise. So, in such specific situations, let's see about platelet transfusion. So, if you're a patient of ITP who has a few purpura on the skin and who has a normal hemoglobin WBC, the platelet count is 1,000. Okay. In these patients, despite seeing that the patient has a very severe thrombocytopenia, you avoid transfusing platelets. Why? Because he has preformed antibodies against platelets. If you transfuse this patient with platelets, then those platelets are going to last for a few minutes only. Within a few minutes time, his body is going to destroy those platelets. So you must actually try and treat that condition. Say ITP is immune thrombocytopenia. You would treat this ITP with steroids rather than transfusing platelets over here. You transfuse platelets only if the patient is actually having active bleeding. Another common situation which is very akin to this is in dengue fever. Okay, you must be seeing a lot of dengue fever. You have patients who have a high hemoglobin, WBC count, which is mild to, which is normal to slightly low, and severe thrombocytopenia, which typically develops after the fever goes away. In these patients also, it is now documented that the patient which produces, once the patient starts producing anti-dengue antibodies, you have a cross reaction of these antibodies with the platelets, and that is why for a few days you tend to destroy your own platelets. So it's like an ITP situation where you're producing antibodies against your own platelets. Here also, if the patient is transfused platelets, they hardly ever last. They'll get destroyed within an hour's time. Okay, so just by looking at the platelet count, don't decide to transfuse, and you keep platelets available. Okay, your blood bank must contain platelets. You book platelets for the patient, but only if the patient say has any bleeding manifestations, you quickly get the platelets and transfuse them. Otherwise, it's of no use. When we give chemotherapy to a patient, we use a platelet cutoff of 10,000, okay, or 20,000. So why this cutoff? Because as I told you, a platelet count of more than 50,000 is sufficient for the body. You will never have bleeding above 50,000. When the platelet count drops below 20,000, you can have spontaneous bleeding. Okay, up to 20,000, you'll have only post-traumatic bleeding. So if you have some injury, you'll have some bleeding. But below 20,000, you can have spontaneous bleeding, mucosal bleeding, or bleeding in the brain. Typically, intracranial hemorrhages are common if your platelet count is below 10,000. Okay. In disseminated intravascular coagulation, we keep a platelet count of 50,000 as cutoff, and surgery 50,000. Okay. Now, the last part of my last two slides of my talk is I'm going to discuss a little bit about something which we have available over here, and I hope it soon becomes available there. Only the only issue in this is the cost. Okay, so leukofiltered blood products. As you know, when you're transfusing any blood component, say RBCs or platelets, they will contain white cells also. They will contain WBCs also, and these WBCs are a nuisance. You don't need those WBCs at all. Okay. Why? Because those WBCs will cause febrile transfusion reactions. Okay, they may see antigens in your body will see antigens in those platelets and in those WBCs, and therefore, sometimes after a blood product transfusion, you'll have severe chills, rigors, sometimes breathing difficulty, and this is because of the leukocytes. So when you remove leukocytes, filter out the leukocytes from that blood product, you are not going to have any febrile transfusion reaction. The blood transfusion goes very smoothly. Sometimes if a patient is already running fever, okay, sometimes he's got 101 fever and he's anemic, and you want to transfuse blood to this patient. Okay, you're worried that the patient is already having fever. If I transfuse blood and that, God forbid, with that blood transfusion, if the patient develops a febrile reaction, the fever is going to become unmanageable. So that if you have that concern, you can give leukofiltered blood. And when you give leukofiltered blood, you can be sure that that product is not going to cause any fever to that patient. The leukofiltration can be either done at the blood bank level itself, where the blood bank attaches a filter to that blood unit and filters off the WBCs in the blood bank, or it can be done at the bedside. So when you instead of attaching the transfusion set to while transfusing, you attach something called as a transfusion filter, and through that the leukocytes are filtered out. It also reduces the chances of ionization because you're not transfusing any white blood cells. So in our blood bank also, we typically in my patients where a lot of transfusions are required, they're immunocompromised, we use as far as possible leukofiltered blood products. And ideally, we are moving towards complete leukofiltration of all our blood products. The only hindrance right now is the cost. It increases the cost of the blood unit by around 500 rupees. So we don't use this routinely. And the last the last concept that you must know is something called as irradiated blood products. For a long time in Pune, only Dinanath was having a blood irradiator, but now Janakalyan also has a blood irradiator, and I think one or more blood banks also have a blood irradiator. So in this, what we do is after we collect the blood, we keep it in a machine which gives radiation to that unit of blood. What does that radiation do? It destroys the lymphocytes in that blood, and it damages the nucleus of the lymphocytes and completely eradicates all the lymphocytes in the blood. Although they are physically present in that blood, their nucleus is destroyed, and therefore they cannot proliferate. Okay, and this prevents a condition called transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. Okay, which is a very important condition, and I would like to just spend a couple of minutes on explaining what this is. Okay, so supposing you are transfused a unit of blood. Okay, in that unit of blood, there are RBCs and there are lymphocytes. There are white blood cells, right? Now, when you transfuse that unit, your body's lymphocytes are going to realize that these are foreign lymphocytes in that unit of blood, and they are going to destroy those lymphocytes, right? So, but if there is a situation where your body is very badly immunocompromised, say you have undergone a bone marrow transplant, or you have certain lymphomas where your immunity is low, or you received certain chemotherapy drugs which destroys your body's lymphocytes, then what is going to happen if you transfuse blood which contains lymphocytes? Those lymphocytes will will recognize that this body is foreign, and they will decide to attack your body. And if they decide to attack your body, they can attack your whole bone marrow, and they can destroy your marrow, and you'll develop a complete aplastic anemia. And this condition is called transfusion associated graft versus host disease. This condition has a mortality of more than 90%. Okay. So in these conditions, such as severe congenital immunodeficiencies, Hodgkin's lymphoma, certain chemotherapy drugs, bone marrow transplants, we prefer to irradiate the blood product by destroying completely the lymphocytes in that blood, so that those lymphocytes cannot attack your body. Okay. And this is very important in one more condition, which I want to stress upon. If you have, I don't know, how much you encourage related donations, right? So supposing you have a blood relative. Suppose there's a patient who and his brother wants to donate blood for him. Okay. Will you accept that unit of blood or not? Do you know this landmark scene in Amarak Branthani नावाचा picture तुम्ही बघितलाय का? Amarak Branthani. In that movie, if you remember, there was a scene where all the three sons, they are donating blood to their mother, and it is a funny scene where all that blood it mixes into one bag, and that whole bag goes into the mother. Okay, and so this is many people are sort of they want to donate for their own mother, they want to donate for their own father, or the brother wants to donate for his sister, and these are called first degree related blood transfusions. And we want to discourage this Amarak Branthani scenario. We don't want to give this. Why? Because in related donor transfusions also, you can occasionally have this condition called transfusion associated graft versus host disease. Why? Because when you're transfusing a related donor's blood, their HLA, the human leukocyte antigen, which is present on the in the white blood cells, that HLA might be partly similar, and therefore your body may not recognize those lymphocytes as foreign. Okay, they may accept those lymphocytes. But if those donors' lymphocytes, they realize that this is a foreign body, they will decide to attack you. And then you can have this transfusion associated GVHD. So from a related donor, if you get a blood transfusion, there is a small chance that you can develop TA-GVHD and you can actually die because of it. Okay. This condition is not known, and therefore it is not commonly recognized. So if you're going to give a first degree relative's blood to the patient, you must irradiate that blood. Is that clear? Or otherwise, don't avoid giving first degree relatives. Use a unrelated person, or just pick up blood from the blood bank or some friends. Those are the people we must encourage, not first degree relatives. Okay, I hope this is clear. So with this, I just wanted to give you key messages, and then after that we can sort of discuss. We can take questions. Whatever questions you want to ask, you can ask me. So just to reiterate again, there is no place today for whole blood in modern medicine. You must transfuse appropriate components guided by lab values rather than only by clinical judgment. Attention must be given to storage conditions during transport, and therefore you must either have storage centers, as many as you can, but avoid this transporting of sending relatives to go to a blood bank and picking up blood from there. This must sort of be avoided as much as we can in future. And use blood rationally. If you are stuck, if you don't know what to do, with which product to transfuse, how much to transfuse, etc., you can always call any of us. We are available on phone. We can always guide you on phone, and I'm available 24/7 for this purpose. So with that, I will end my talk. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Sir, we are very thankful for such an informative and innovative session. And I think, sir, you stress on every and each and every point of separation, component separation. Sir, please stop the screen sharing.
Yeah.
So the four components of blood, that is Paxil volume, plasma, cryoprecipitation, and platelets. So I think each and every point is discussed in descriptively, sir. So the viewers here, yes, from different talukas, all the user doctors are there. So behalf of Janaka and behalf of you, so I am appealing that all doctors, so if they are want to share or interact, they can interact. We have a team of medical directors with us. Dr. Sunil is there, Dr. Pawar VP is there, and behalf of all, so I am appealing, requesting you ask questions. Anybody want to share or anybody want to interact?
Sir, I have a
Hello.
question. Can I ask question?
Yes, yes.
Just Dr. Sunil Nandgaonkar is there. Please.
Sir, 50,000.
Anil, unmute. Anil, unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Hello.
Yes,
Sir, am I audible?
yes, Dr. Sunil, you are audible. Please.
You said 50,000 platelet count is enough for doing any surgery.
Yes.
So is it necessary to find out any other cause before going for the surgery for thrombocytopenia?
Yes, of course. I mean, you must know why the patient has a low platelet count. And that is of course important. And generally, it is understood that you know why the patient has that platelet count. So, supposing you have a patient who say has a ITP, okay, and his platelet count is 60,000. Patient who is pregnancy she has ITP, she has developed ITP. The platelet count is say 50-60,000. I know that this patient is very unlikely to bleed. Supposing you have given chemotherapy to a patient and there is an emergency surgery to be done post chemotherapy, and the patient has dropped his blood counts and the platelet count is about 50,000, you can very well operate. If the platelet count is lower than that, then I'm going to transfuse platelets, make sure they cross 50,000 and then operate.
So only emergency surgery we should go ahead, and elective surgery we find out what is the cause and then.
Always, yes, always.
Sir,
Hello,
one
sir.
question.
Yes.
I think,
Hello,
Dr.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Gokhale, sir.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Gokhale, and little different from this component topic. But I want to ask you, how will you approach to a patient of a severe leukopenia, either by dengue or non-dengue fever?
Yeah. Approach to severe leukopenia, again, it depends upon what the cause is. If it is a dengue, say if it is a, the patient had a normal count earlier and then he has developed an infection. And after that, you have seen over the next few days that the WBC count is precipitously dropping down. It has dropped down to 500 or 1000. There I know, and I have the diagnosis in hand, it's a viral infection. I know that this is a virus-induced transient maturation arrest of the myeloid series. Okay, so in this situation, most of the times I do nothing, because after the virus is destroyed by the body, automatically the WBC count is going to improve. But if I'm worried, about a secondary infection, I'm going to give this patient a drug called filgrastim, or granulocyte colony stimulating factor. It is easily available now. It costs about 500 rupees for one injection. You give about 2-3 days of this injection, quickly the maturation arrest is sort of is overdriven, and the WBC count will increase, because that's what we typically use. But if the leukocyte count, the leukopenia is because of, say, post chemotherapy, then I'm going to give filgrastim, allow the counts to go up quickly. So you need to understand why the count has actually dropped low and therefore decide to transfuse. If the patient develops a severe infection during with neutropenia, and I know that the neutropenia is going to take another say 7 to 10 days to improve, there I'm going to give this patient granulocyte transfusions. It's not a very easy thing to do. It's a very tedious sort of job, a very demanding thing. And but we have it available in our hospital, and we quickly organize donors and do a granulocyte transfusion for these patients.
Hello.
Thanks.
Actually, that was my first next question. Ki granulocyte transfusion.
Yeah.
How it is difficult and how it is,
Yeah.
difficult to set up in a place like Mahad.
Yeah. So for that, for granulocyte transfusion, first of all, you need do you have a cell separator, sir?
Yeah. Yes.
You have a cell separator?
Yes.
Okay, then you can very well do it. The only thing is that it is unlikely that you may use it, because typically granulocyte transfusions is required in a situation where in diseases which are very demanding, so very high doses of chemotherapy. I don't know if you do these treatments there, but somebody who's receiving high doses of chemotherapy and he has become very severely neutropenic. In that situation only you need to give granulocyte transfusions. You need to have a donor who is blood group matched, first of all. Platelets, we don't bother too much about the blood group. In emergency situation, we can always give any blood group to any person. But for granulocytes, you have to have a blood group match, because a lot of RBCs contaminate the granulocytes. And the donor has to receive one dose of GCSF, filgrastim, 12 hours before the procedure, and one dose of steroid to mobilize the neutrophils into the blood 1 hour before the procedure. So the donor is actually given a drug. So it becomes a little difficult to sort of convince the donor. And then they have to be screened in advance. Once you organize them, then 12 hours prior they have to come to the blood bank. They have to take the injection. Again, come 12 hours later. Then they go on to the cell separator. And then after that product is prepared, you have to irradiate it. You cannot give unirradiated blood most of the times to very severely neutropenic patients. So that is the hitch.
Tedious.
Thanks, sir.
Not
I think
easy.
Dr. Srikanth Ranade wants to ask something. Dr. Adhu.
Hello.
Can I ask
Hello.
Dr. Rahul?
Please continue, sir. Just a minute.
Dr. Aditya, please accept my compliment. It was a very good lecture and so many good take-home messages. Basically, I'm pediatrician and I would like to ask, in thalassemia, refractory anemias, especially we deal with thalassemias and sickle cell anemia.
Yes.
Of course, we prefer PCV or RBC, what you said, rather than whole blood. Nowadays, they say that RBCs with leukocyte depletion should be transfused. Is it possible in our blood bank?
Yeah, it is easily possible, sir.
How it can be created?
Yeah, so there are techniques of there are techniques of leuko reduction while preparing the component, while doing the component separation. But this type of what I mentioned about leuko-filtered blood, leuko-filtered blood is different from just a slight reduction in the. So when we deplete leukocytes, we talk about how many log reduction in the leukocytes there is. So with a simple technique of blood, of leuko reduction, you can remove them by 1 log. That's a simple way in which while preparing the blood component itself, you can remove 1 log reduction. Preferably, what you must do is what I mentioned. Use a leukocyte filter while transfusing that blood product. So there is complete there is a 3 to 4 log reduction in the WBCs that are transfused, and therefore the patient will not get allergic.
So, thanks, sir.
Yeah.
Corporate Surgeon Dr. Srikanth Ranade wants to share any question.
Hello.
Hello.
Dr. Ranade.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
you are audible, sir.
Yeah, it was a very nice talk, Dr. Nilangiri. And in fact, recently we had a casualty of bleeding collapse in our hospital, and who was B negative, and we needed to transfuse him with many transfusions. And
Yes.
you in fact gave me a very valuable information that in such patients, even a positive blood group could have been transfused, because we had a very hard time finding negative donors. So it was a good information for us. And
I like to ask whether these patients need to be given that RH NTD injections later on.
No, no, sir. It will not work because the amount of transfusion that you were given is quite massive, and therefore anti-D will not really prevent alloimmunization. That is okay in the in the pregnancy situation where
Okay.
where you expect a very small fetal-maternal bleed, a little bit of RBCs are transfused. So there, you can quickly give anti-D and prevent alloimmunization. But when you're given a whole unit of blood, then it is very difficult to prevent.
Then what things we have to do later on?
Nothing. Just hope that the patient doesn't. There are not all patients will develop antibodies. Some patients you may not actually develop anti-RH antibodies also even after exposure. You're lucky in that case. But if the patient does develop anti-RH antibodies, then in future transfusions you should avoid giving RH positive blood in such patients. That's all you can do.
Will there be any?
Yeah, but remember that even if supposing he has developed anti-RH antibodies, and again you're in a situation where you have to transfuse positive blood, you can transfuse that blood also. It will last for about 1 or 2 days in the body. It will not cause immediate intravascular hemolysis. Okay, that blood lasts for about a day or two, and then it will get destroyed outside the blood, meaning in the spleen and the liver. Okay, it is it's not like an ABO mismatch blood transfusion where you would have immediate intravascular hemolysis. RH mismatch will cause only destruction of the RBCs inside the liver and spleen. So it will cause a delayed hemolysis, which will happen 1 or 2 days later.
Okay. Will there be any legal implications?
Will there be any
legal implications of giving such a blood?
No, yeah, there won't be legal implications because you have to. You can take a consent from the patient. But otherwise, it's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Samit. Can I speak to you?
Yes, sir.
Hi.
Good evening.
Hi, Samit. Good evening. Well, you were at your best as usual, and it was very much informative. The components and their different indications and all that. One simple question.
Yes.
Is it necessary to do ABO typing, cross-matching before granulocyte transfusion?
Before granulocyte transfusion, yes, it is very important to give because when you're separating granulocytes, you will have a lot of contamination of RBCs as well, red blood cells as well.
Okay.
Whereas when you're supposing you're doing a platelet collection, the RBC layer is quite different, is quite far away from the platelet layer when the in the centrifuge. So when you're giving platelets, you will not have RBC contamination. But when you're taking granulocytes, the RBC layer is right next to it, and therefore you will have a lot of contamination of RBCs also. So the blood product does look quite red, and therefore you can have you must have a blood group match.
One simple question, actually, during our practice, not only me, but most of the people, they must have observed that while treating patients of dengue,
yes,
see, even the platelet count has dropped down to even 15,000. We hardly come across a bleeding disorder.
Absolutely right.
Right. See, what must be the reason that patients do not have even PET-HE, purpuric spots, or any bleeding disorder? And we have never, see, even I have come across a patient whose platelet count was 10,000.
Yes.
Even that patient could recover without any bleeding disorder. What must be there was a sort of a dysfunctional, there was no dysfunction, even though count was on subnormal side. Functionally, platelets were absolutely normal. That must be the reason. But actually, what is any other reason?
No, there is another very important reason. I have seen platelets of 1,000 in dengue also without any bleeding.
Oh.
Yes, 1,000, and we have not transfused platelets to that patient also. So the reason why this happens is that in ITP or in dengue, remember that the bone marrow is functioning normally. Okay, so the platelets are being destroyed by the anti-dengue antibodies, which are cross-reacting with the platelets. So there is destruction of our platelets, but the marrow is functioning normally. So it is producing newer, fresh platelets, trying to meet the demand. And all these new platelets are very thrombogenic. As compared to old platelets, the new platelets are being generated are very thrombogenic and active. And therefore, because the marrow is functioning, it can increase the platelet production several fold to meet the demand. Although the platelets will get destroyed soon, the life of those platelets may be only in minutes, but they're constantly being produced. Whereas if you have a situation where a patient has received chemotherapy, the bone marrow has been transiently very badly suppressed, and it is not able to produce more platelets. So the chances of bleeding in this patient is more, because the marrow is not producing platelets. So it's a problem of production versus destruction. If it's a destruction related problem, there's no problem. The bleeding is very low.
Okay.
So one
thanks,
comment
sir.
on this, sir,
Thanks,
if
sir.
you permit, Bhaskar sir,
Uh,
please. One comment on this. Probably all the doctors are tempted to give platelets, even it is 20,000, 10,000, as you said very correctly, 5,000
Yes.
or 1,000 without bleeding. We should not give. And
Yes.
I think that we do more harm than doing some benefit to this. So take home message: don't give platelet transfusion unless and until there is some bleeding.
Yeah. So
No,
I have
Dr.
one more comment.
Dabarkar, no, just one more thing, Dr. Dabarkar.
Yes,
Actually, it's
yes,
not
sir.
possible to transfuse the platelets in a place like Mad or Margao. Okay, carrying the platelets from the platelets offering center, it's difficult to carry those platelets. Whether what till we transfuse platelets, whether in what condition those platelets will be, that is again a thing to be considered.
Yes.
So there is no point in attempting even platelet transfusion
Yes.
at our place. If at all somebody
Many
needs
doctors
platelet
are there
transfusion, that
who
is
give
to be
demand to
transfused.
platelet bhej do. So I think
Wait,
that
we have to transfer
is
transfer the
correct.
patient.
Yeah.
Okay.
But sometimes sir, what the problem that we face is, the patient ला सांगितलं गेलं असतं की इकडे प्लेटलेट्स अवेलेबल नाही, तुला प्लेटलेट्स लागणार आहेत तिकडे दिनानाथ मध्ये जा, म्हणजे तिकडे प्लेटलेट्स अवेलेबल, तिकडे डॉक्टर तुला प्लेटलेट्स चढवतील. And they come to the hospital saying that, okay, we have come here for platelet transfusion. And then it is our job to tell them, I'm not going to give you platelets. So,
Right.
why you are not going to give?
Correct.
So
Nitya,
whatever I
think-
explained to you, I explained it the same manner I explained to the patient, saying that these platelets, if I give you, they are going to stay for 1 hour only in your blood. So instead of that, I'm going to observe you carefully. Platelets are ready. They are available in the blood bank. लागलं तर लगेच 5 मिनिटात मी मागून देईन. And then,
Great.
the patients are convinced. They need to understand also why we are not doing it.
I think we switch over to the
Hello?
next question. Yes,
Rahul, can you hear
Ranade
me?
madam. Yes, you are audible, madam. Dr.
Yeah,
Ranade
can you
madam.
hear me?
Dr. Seema Ranade is a senior anesthetiist. She want to ask some question. Please, madam. Please
Hello?
continue, madam. You are audible, madam.
Dr. Melin Keri, sir, thanks so much for your valuable information because we literally deal with blood and blood components every day. Now, what I wanted to ask you is, what is the giant platelet syndrome? Because many times it happens that the platelet count comes around 40,000 or whatever, 30,000. The patient is symptom free. We have to post him for surgery. But because of thrombocytopenia, we are a bit in a dilemma. And then the pathologist says, no, it's a giant platelet syndrome. So do we need to worry about it?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm surprised that somebody from Mahad has asked me this question. I wonder, the reason I'm saying this is because, in certain areas of India, typically in Bengal, most commonly in Northeast India, Bengal, Assam, and also in Kashmir. Okay. These people, they right from birth, their platelets are large in size. Okay, and because they're large, they're normal functioning platelets, but they're large in size, and therefore the cell counter is primed to recognize platelets only of a certain size as platelets. If it is larger than that, the platelet count the machine is going to miss those platelets, not going to count it as a platelet count, and therefore the machine will give artificially low platelet values. So they may be 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 that way. Actually, the platelet count is more than that. So in this situation, what we do is we look at the blood smear, and there is a way of manually calculating the platelet count. And then we can say that, actually on the smear, we can see many platelets which are there. The platelet count is actually more than 1 lakh. And therefore, we call this as a giant platelet syndrome. So also in general, whenever platelets are, say an ITP situation where the bone marrow is producing new platelets are always larger in size. Okay, old platelets become smaller in size. So if it's in an ITP where the platelet count is, say the machine is given a value of 10,000, correctly it is, or 20,000, but actually when you look at the cell count, you see that the platelets are larger in size, and some of them are the on smear they look say double the value that the machine has given you. Then you can say, okay, because there were giant platelets, the machine has missed it, and this is the actual platelet count.
Okay,
that's what it means.
But what about the working or the efficiency?
They are absolutely normal. They are absolutely functioning platelets.
Okay.
They are normal platelets.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay.
I think Dr. Bhaskar sir is on the line. Do you want to ask him? Bhaskar sir.
Yes. Now in the COVID, we are getting thrombocytosis more than 5 lakhs or more than 5 lakhs platelets. And some patients we get a thrombocytopenia with a delayed D dimer. Whether it's a benefited with a thrombin inhibitor or just to neglect.
Okay. First of all, honor talking to you, sir. This is the first time I have met you.
Yes, thank you.
In the COVID situation, the thrombogenicity is because not so much related to the platelet count, but it is related to the fact that there is a lot of the small microvascular injury, and therefore there is a propensity to develop thrombosis because of vessel injury rather than the high platelet count. And therefore all these patients who are so what we do is all platelets need some form, all COVID patients need some form of blood thinners. If generally what we have been practicing is that if the patient has severe COVID, that means the patient is requiring oxygen or has a very high D dimer, we then give them anticoagulants. We give them now the directly acting oral anticoagulants or low molecular weight heparin. If the patient is sort of mild COVID, ambulatory, younger side, we give them just aspirin. And all patients at the time of discharge from the hospital, we do the D dimer test again. D dimer gives you a rough value of what whether the extent of the the coagulopathy could be. So if the D dimer is more than 1,500, we give them a DOAC for the next 1 month. And if it is less than 1,500, we've been giving them aspirin. But there are no clear guidelines on which patient we should give an anticoagulant in COVID and which patient we should give antiplatelet. This is something which the American Society of Hematology has has devised, and this is what we're following in Dinath Mangeshkar Hospital. This is sort of my policy, and this is what we have accepted in our hospital. But it can be slightly different in other hospitals.
Most important, because of now FFP is very well used for the DIC's Russell Viper, and many patients are survived because of renal failure because of
absolutely right.
The only indication of FFP is absolutely very important for the rural patients.
Right. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, thanks, sir. I think the medical director Dr. Sunil Nandagaur wants to ask some question. Dr. Sunil, please.
Sir, NSAID also causes dysfunctional platelets. So what are the chances that patients will bleed during surgery? Because a lot of patients that keep on taking NSAID for months together, years together for arthritis and some non-specific causes. What are the chances they will bleed during surgery?
Yes, good question. So if the question is if the patient is on an antiplatelet drug, what is the chance that the patient will bleed during surgery? So if the patient is the aspirin tends to be the lowest, the mildest of the antiplatelet drugs, followed by clopidogrel, and then the ticagrelor and the prasugrel, which are the newer platelets. They are very powerful. Okay, so they have a much higher chance of bleeding. If the patient is on aspirin, in general, we see whether the patient is on aspirin because of a primary reason or a secondary reason, meaning has he had a heart attack in the past, has he had a stroke in the past, and that is the reason why he's on aspirin. Then we prefer to keep the aspirin on board while doing the surgery. Patients rarely bleed when on aspirin. Okay, and even if the bleeding is there, it is quite mild. So we don't worry too much about aspirin or being on board during surgery. If it's not a very important indication for giving aspirin, say it is a lesser important indication, you can always stop the aspirin at least about 4 days prior to the surgery and then decide to operate the patient. If the patient is on clopidogrel, then the chance of bleeding is higher. In an emergency situation, just go ahead, never worry about antiplatelets. But you can always transfuse platelets, in case the patient does have a bleeding manifestation in top. But if it is possible on clopidogrel, we must stop the drug at least 4 days prior to the surgery.
So, and what are the chances of NSAID causing bleeding?
NSAID causing?
Painkiller.
I couldn't hear you. NSAID causing bleeding, is it? NSAID causing bleeding, the incidence is quite low actually, sir. And massive major bleeding the chances are very low. So generally, we don't worry too much about it. But whenever possible, of course, you must take the NSAID off. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, sir. I think Dr. Anil Joshi on the line from KAID. Dr. Anil, you want to ask something? Anybody else? Thanks, sir, for such a very nice, informative session. And very descriptive in manner, and also the interactive session along with that. So, behalf of the President of Jana Kalyan, Dhananjay Paranspe, and the medical directors, we are very thankful to you. And before concluding the session, I will switch over the mic to Dr. Raju Gokhale. He is the acting president of Janak Kalyan Blood Bank, and he will sum up. So I am requesting Dr. Raju Gokhale, sir.
Thank you, Rahul.
Sum up and conclude.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Rahul. First of all, let me thank immensely Dr. Samir that for the first time in the history of blood bank at Mahad, we are listening to such an informative and to the point lecture. And I think people must have appreciated your lecture very nicely. The importance of this lecture was we are entering in a new era as far as Janak Kalyan Blood Bank at Mahad is concerned. Because so far we have been using whole blood, as you said, the concept of whole blood was, absent in all the mega hospitals or modern hospitals or multi-specialty hospitals in big cities. But here it was still going on, and we knew that we desperately need to switch over to a component unit. But due to some constraints, financial constraints, our utility constraints, it was delayed. But now it has come into a reality, and we are thankful to our donors who have made this possible, because to establish a component unit was not a small job. It required a big fund, and that fund has come from donations of all the companies and individual donations also. No activity like this, which is run by a no-profit organization, is possible without donations of generous donors. And that is why I must thank to all these donors at this outset. And I must thank Dr. Samir also, who has clearly given a pat on our back because we have started a component separation unit. Because according to him, there is no indication of whole blood now. And so what we were doing was unindicated work. So now let us start doing indicated work from today onwards. So there was no indication of whole blood, except when the components were not available. That is what we were doing. And also he told us about transfuse appropriate components to the patients and therefore use blood rationally. So these are all three are very proper messages which are important for our doctors, and I must thank Dr. Samir for them. Next thing I wanted to appeal to all other listeners is that because of generous donations, we have succeeded in getting the component separation unit. Now it is the responsibility of all of us to run that unit properly, because for running that unit also some amount of funds are required, because it is always a negative, because demand and supply mismatch is always there. To sustain this unit on its own requires a big consumption of units, and which is not possible right now at Mahad. So we are at deficit. We will be at deficit for at least 1 year. So I must appeal to all these doctors that you all donate generously to this noble cause, so that we all will fight to the diseases, and will all fight rationally, as Dr. Samir has rightly said. So my appeal once again for all the doctors to donate generously, and my thanks once again to Dr. Samir to give a very informative lecture. And I must say, Dr. Samir, that we are not going to leave you at this point. We will be troubling you off and on. Whenever we are in trouble.
My phone is always on, sir. You can call me anytime.
Yeah, whenever we will be in trouble, we will call you, sir.
Yes.
So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Sir, we are very thankful to you to spare valuable time with us. So, on behalf of all directors, medical directors, Dr. Sunil Nandgaonkar, PTO, Dr. Pawar, President Dr. Dhananjay Paranspe, and the acting President Dr. Raju Gokhale, I am once again thankful to you. And sir, please allow me to conclude the session. Sir, we are ending the session. Please permit us to end the session.